Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Ready Learner One Lounge. This week, my name is Jesse Lubinsky, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer for Ready Learner One. Thank you for showing your emoji love. We encourage you to do that throughout the show, for those of you who are here live in the room. And I want to introduce our Executive Director of Immersive Learning. This is Bobby Carlton. Bobby Carlton is going to introduce our guest for this week, and he'll be moderating what is going to be a really exciting conversation. We've been looking forward to this for a few weeks. So, Bobby, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jesse, for that warm introduction. Yes, I'm Bobby Carlton. Thanks for coming out. I'm going to introduce our guest right here. This is Ryan Andes right here. Can we get some emojis for Ryan? Ryan is an actor. This is a picture of Ryan in the real world, if you can look behind me. Ryan has been in shows such as Peter Pan Live on NBC, the show You on Netflix, Big Fish on the theater, As the World Turns. He's also done some voiceover work. He's the voice of Grimlock on Cartoon Network's Transformers Cyberverse, right? Am I correct with that, Ryan?
That's right. And Shockwave.
Okay. And Shockwave. So two of the bad guys. Because Shockwave, Grimlock is an Autobot. Shockwave is a Decepticon.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly.
He was Galactus.
He's the voice of Galactus. So today's show is we're really exploring how different roles require different types of learning approaches, and whether you're learning in theater or acting, or whether you're learning in the corporate world, workforce, or whether you're learning in K through 12 and higher ed, it really is learning is learning, but we're kind of exploring it in a much different angle today. So Ryan, if you wanted. Could you talk a little bit about yourself quickly, and then I'll ask a couple questions, maybe to tell everybody about your background and everything?
Yeah, I'd love to. Hey guys, I'm Ryan Andes. Nice to see y'all in digital form. So I come from an acting sort of family. My grandfather was a Broadway actor who then made his way into Hollywood and built a pretty beefy career as an actor there. His name is Keith Andes, if anybody feels like jumping on the Google, and you'll find him pretty easily. His first movie was with Marilyn Monroe. He played opposite her. He then went on to do movies with Angela Lansbury. He had a TV show with Glynis Johns. He was on Star Trek in the second season, and he cameoed in an episode called The Apple. And even cooler, what I think, at least, because I'm such a voiceover guy now, he was the original Birdman on the original Hanna-Barbera cartoon, which I think is
awesome.
So Grandpa kind of laid the foundation here, and he also had like a really majestic voice. He was this golden-voiced baritone and this handsome leading man type, and he bequeathed unto me the voice that I think I now have, and so it was only natural for me to kind of follow in the old man's footsteps, and that's kind of how I got myself to getting into acting and singing. I studied opera for years before I came to New York, thinking I was going to come to the city to be an opera singer, and I ended up getting into theater and voiceover and doing literally everything but opera.
Well, that's how it goes, right?
Yep, it is. It's weird, man. But I got to flex those musical muscles. I got onto Broadway in 2013, playing Carl the Giant in Big Fish, which was such a cool thing. The neatest thing about that is that Grandpa actually played opposite Lucille Ball in a musical called Wildcat in 1960, and he debuted that musical in a theater called the Alvin, which eventually became the Neil Simon, and that was where I debuted my first show on Broadway. So I had this cool connection from my grandfather to the Broadway world, and got to share the same stage as he played on over 50 years later, which is such a trip.
Very cool.
Yeah. So and then eventually I got further into TV and film, and then voiceover, which has really become the thing that I do more than anything now. Yeah.
Interesting. So you talked a little bit about your background. What kind of growing up? What kind of learner were you? Were you how what kind? Like, were you really good at school? Were you really like how? What was it? Memorizing things? Like what process did you go through?
It's a good question. I think I still am, as I was as a child, a very kinesthetic type of learner. I love to read. I absorb music and media so well. But for me, the things that stick with me the most are the things that I get to do with my hands and do physically, and so that is, I think that's why it manifests so well as into being an actor, because you put your whole self into that process. You're using all kinds of learning. I think your audio learning, your visual learning, all of that comes into play. But I think the kinesthetic learning is the stuff that really pays off, especially when you're on stage.
Does like being physically in motion a big part of the learning for you? Like, does that help?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, it's interesting because, we're talking about performing, but there's so many different facets of performing. There's, TV and theater are much different from each other. Doing voiceover and doing TV are very different from each other. But they all kind of involve the same technique. Even with opera, right? Like you have to sort of embody the thing. Even if you're sitting behind a microphone, you've got to feel it all the way through you to make it real, to make it honest, and to convince people that you're telling the truth, right?
Interesting. And so when you take on a new role, is there research involved? Like when you, like for example, on the show, your character, like how much research went into something like that versus doing something like a Broadway show, or live like Peter Pan or something like that?
Sure. I mean, each one of those are very different from each other. With TV's much more nuanced, a little more subtle. But I think the essence is kind of the same. For me, at least, I always try to find a paradigm, right? Like a touchstone, something that will bring me back to what I consider to be like the essence of that character when I'm portraying that person. So with you, I was playing a pretty natural version of myself, but with this sort of PI slant, kind of an investigator with a little bit of like a no bullshit New York type vibe. And so I pull from different things. I pulled from TV that I watch. I pull from actors that I know, and I sort of find it that way. But I think the broader strokes are what I find more interesting. For example, with Big Fish, I played Carl the Giant, which is a very big embodiment of a giant, yeah. Right? Like I'm this monster on stage. Let's see, I think we just saw it. There we go. There. Yeah. Anyway, we had him for a minute there, but
I'll get it back.
Yeah. It's all good. But Carl was one of those things that really took some exploring, right? And I remember when I auditioned for Susan Stroman and everybody in the creative team, and I booked the role my first audition, which is crazy. It doesn't happen in Broadway, man. Usually you go through callbacks and you have to, talk and figure out, if you're the right fit, and that takes time. But for this one, I had spent so much time doing the research beforehand. So for Carl, I pulled from a lot of lore. I pulled from Winnie the Pooh. I remember using Eeyore was my big touchstone.
Really? Okay.
for Carl, and I brought that to the room with I had a very specific idea in mind for Carl, and I think it was that specificity that they saw when I was in there, and it was one of those things when after I was done doing the audition, they had me read it a few times. They asked for a few adjustments, but really the essence of the character was kind of there at the beginning. And I finished the audition. I said my thanks, and I walked out into the hallway. And Susan Stroman followed me out into the hallway, and she pulled me aside and she said, "Ryan, that was the best audition we've seen for this. be ready for a phone call. Like,
That's awesome.
blew my mind. But so that was so informative because I did have to build some nuance around Carl after that. Obviously, the more time you spend, the more you discover. But for me, Eeyore was still always kind of my touchdown for him.
That's
slow,
it's interesting.
lugubrious.
So you say that your curation process really was sort of pulling from things from your childhood and then things from like current what was happening currently.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very layered, I think.
Go ahead. Do you
I
use
just think
stuff like
that it's-
YouTube at all or anything like that?
To some degree. It's funny. I think what I find using the most are the paradigms that I remember from my childhood. So, for example, when I did Otherworld, which is how I met you, Bobby, was
That's right.
working on that show in Saratoga Springs. Yeah, there it is. That's us.
Right. That's Ryan. He's playing a space pirate trainer, I believe, is what you were playing.
I think it was. Yeah.
Yes,
such a good time.
This is a picture of my lab when I was at the Mazie Center, and we were running this program called Spring Space, which is sort of this experimental theater program. And Ryan is where I met him. He was one of the actors in the program.
And I was playing the bad guy in that show. As I'm in Otherworld, which by the way still is on track to hopefully get to Broadway in the next year or so. But I'm playing Antagon, who is he's the antagonist. They didn't really come up. Their creativity of the name.
It works.
It works. It totally works. Yeah, listen, there's no doubt in your mind who the bad guy is. But I remember we really worked on figuring out, how to represent Antagon as the epitome of the most evil person in this world. And my immediate references were things that I think speak the most truth to being a bad guy. Scar from The Lion King was one of my first touchstones, and then Jafar from Aladdin, which is ridiculous because these guys are cartoons, but it's the essence of bad guys, especially when it's distilled in that way, in in the Disney format. They actually really do it very well, right? And if you can pull the essence from those guys and bring it to life, I think you've got yourself a pretty good bouquet of evil.
Yeah, I would think so. So this is, if you look at this, is a picture from Peter Pan Live. And so what's it like doing a live show in the sense of what do you do if a mistake happens? Like how do you collect yourself, especially in a situation where you can't have mistakes?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm going to be honest with you right now. There were plenty of mistakes. It's just that we rehearsed so much. I mean, we were so ready for the live event that even the mistakes that we made were trivial at that point. And we were so comfortable with the piece by then that even if something did go really wrong, we could figure out a way to fix it. And they went wrong. Let me tell you. Like there was the big sword fight. I don't know how many of you guys watched this thing because it was, let's just be honest, it was a bit of a shit show. It really was. But there was some really funny parts. But Christopher Walken, it was as if he had never held a sword in his entire life, and he had to do this big sword fight with Peter Pan at the very end. And I'm not kidding when I tell you, if you watch it, you'll see it absolutely train wreck. Like it just does not work. And the rest of us are behind Chris, just giving it 150% to try to make it look in some way exciting. But it is one of the weirdest experiences to have to do that. You're basically opening and closing a Broadway show in one night. It starts, it's done, and then that's it. You break it down, you go home, and it's over. That's it.
So, considering that the people who will be listening to this podcast later, are educators or even learning managers in corporate environments, and a lot of times they're in situations where it's a semi-rehearsed, but they can't. You have to roll with the punches type of scenario. What kind of advice would you give them? How would you recover from a mistake?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, The best thing that I can say about that, because again, it happens, and as I'm sure we all know, it happens all the time. Yeah, I think it's really boils down to, and this is like the most basic form of advice that I can give is, you just don't let them see you sweat, right? As long as you are convincingly still present and like and roll with the punches, you can pretty much pull off anything. And I think it has a lot to do with just your confidence, your comfort level, and your ability to kind of just bounce back without letting it affect you. If you apologize for your mistake, or if you somehow are chagrined by your mistake, the audience knows, man. They sniff that stuff out. But if you just kind of blow past it and don't even acknowledge it or apologize for it, you're better off, I think, for it. You can just let it ride.
That's good advice. Like that, it's like when you see a band play and they make a mistake, they don't stop the show. They just kind of keep going and move forward. So we talked a little bit about your work in acting. You also have a business.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your business and sort of the learning process of that as well?
Oh man, yeah, and what it was such a left turn for me, and yet it wasn't, because I like I mentioned, I am a kinesthetic, hands-on kind of guy, and I always have been, and that's mostly thanks to my dad. My dad was a guitar player, professional guitar player, and a painter, and a furniture builder, and a model boat builder, and all types of things.
Wow.
And the guy could
lots of things.
Do all the things, yeah. And so when I'd hang with my dad, we'd spend a lot of time in the garage, and he would teach me how to build a box, or make a piece of jewelry, or work with metal, or soldering, or whatever. And so it kind of, from an early age, I had this instruction on how to build things, right? It's sort of like sort of like demystified the process a bit. And so years later, I found myself really interested in jewelry, in metalwork, and in leatherwork. I got involved working with like fashion denim guys. I was making specialty hardware for denim companies for a little while there, just kind of as a side gig, back in like 2010 or 11. And so that skill sort of grew, and I got more and more interested until about 2017. I finally decided to make a jump into launching my own brand as a leatherworker and a jeweler. And so the brand consists of making custom wedding rings for people, making custom jewelry, doing custom leather work with my own buckles that I carve and cast myself. I do wallets and bags, and camera straps, and all types of fancy accessories.
What's the name of the company?
It's called Finely Wrought. And,
Finely Wrought. And there's a website, obviously?
Yeah, the website is www.finely-wrought.com, and of course I have an Instagram, which is the name Finely Wrought as well.
Interesting. And so you learned that through sort of passed on knowledge. You were in a sense, your father had mentored you in this process, and were there styles that he had went to you like that worked for you the best? Like, was it more just hands-on? Was it just sort of a conversation, or like a blended environment? How was that for you?
It's interesting. It feels like it's like a big amalgamation of all the things that I love and am interested in via my dad and via the people that I know, or the things that I grew passionate about as I learned more about the world. So like with fashion, I loved the raw denim world, and I got really into classic workwear. So that informed a bit of how I design things and what I make. My dad was a lover of the Old West and Native American art, and so there was a bunch of that influence that came into my work as well. It feels like whenever I make something, it is a distillation of these various influences, and they all kind of combine themselves into a piece that I feel is well made and crafted to be used and built for life. It's everything that I make is the intention behind it is to be heritage quality and used for a very long time.
And passed on or
yes.
Right. I mean, basically,
it becomes an heirloom.
Yeah, it becomes an heirloom, and And if you think about sort of education, right? Different learning styles are in a sense are heirlooms, right? We have a teacher
Yeah,
who learned one way, and then they grew up and they
exactly.
became a teacher, and they brought that same style into their classroom, and the cycle just kind of continues, and it sort of goes beyond that.
No,
Um,
it's a good point,
talk,
Bobby. Yeah, for sure.
Talking a little bit, I want to talk a little bit going back to your world of acting. You
Sure.
talked a little bit about your voiceover work. And we have this great picture of you in the booth. um,
Yep, that's
is
my
that a
daily
typical
life.
day?
That is
that
that
it?
is a day in the life of. That's my closet in Queens. I've got my Sennheiser set up, and then listen, I book a lot of jobs looking just like this.
Okay. All right. Um, do you think? So tell us about the process about the room that you're using. Like, what kind of environment do you need to have when you're doing this
Yeah.
type of voiceover work? Like, what are you looking for?
Yeah, this has actually been this has been a learning process for me too, because previous to the current pandemic, most voiceover jobs that I booked were taking place in studios in New York City, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then as a result of everything shutting down, artists like myself who, I had a mic and a setup that I would use for auditions at home, but we had to make a pretty, a legitimate jump into building a studio, a functioning studio that could produce broadcast quality audio in a very short amount of time, because so many things were like, especially with auditions for voiceover, were still happening. And if you didn't stay on that train, man, you were going to be left behind.
Right.
Um,
Right. And so
so
COVID-19 made you had to change the way you worked in a sense.
absolutely. Yeah, it truly did. It forced me to learn how to build a studio. And look, I know looking at this, it's nothing fancy, but I will say this. I've done over a dozen jobs at home now, and 95% of here's what I'm saying. The engineers that I work with say that over 95% of people that they work with don't have a setup that sounds as good as mine. And it's simple. It's just my mic. I just have to make sure the room is baffled enough so that it doesn't bounce sound around. And I've got an interface that connects to the computer. And with that setup, I can give broadcast quality, which is really cool, man.
Really. And so the learning curve was quick. You were forced into it, and you basically found yourself sort of I don't want to say scrambling, but you found yourself adjusting.
I'd say that's a pretty good word for it, Bobby. It was a scramble, but it was one that really paid off. And it's funny because now, and I think a lot of people are finding this to be the case, because of COVID, we're finding ourselves, we're finding that we don't necessarily need to go other places to do certain work, and that this has kind of taught us that a lot of work can happen from home now, and if it's done right, you can really accidentally put a palm in your face, buddy. But a lot of work can happen from home, and I think this is a really good example of that.
Interesting. Tell me about when you're doing voiceover work. So, as we talked about, you were the voice of Galactus,
Yes.
and you're also the voice of Grimlock and Shockwave in Transformers. How
True.
are those characters so? I mean, they're obviously these sort of fantasy characters, but they're not that you don't have that ability to be kinetic. So how do you do those voices? Like, and is your body in motion while you're doing them?
Yes, they are in a different way. I mean, you do have to, again, like I think there is something very important about having it in you and feeling it all the way through you to make it to give a good performance and to make it sound honest and true. For example, like with Galactus is one of the most interesting jobs I've ever had to do, and the reason is,
In what way?
well, so I booked Galactus, and the reason they hired me, not only because my voice I think is so like deep and booming, it's because I have phonetic. I have a background in phonetic learning because of opera. What they wanted, Paul Bay was the director, he wanted me to be able to speak Galactus's lines in over 9 different languages. All right.
Wow.
So So every time
Okay.
it's a trip, dude. So I had to record Galactus's line, which was something like "Galactus is coming" or something like that, right? And then on the script below that line, I had 9 versions of that line in Spanish, Italian, Hebrew, German, Korean, Polish, Japanese. I mean, it was as many as you could fit into a page. And I figured out quickly how to do that, right? Like, I mean, a lot of it was just figuring out how the language sounds. It didn't have to be that specific, but it was absolutely one of the hardest things. And you're giving every time you open your mouth as Galactus, you're pouring 150% of yourself into the microphone. Like I just did a little bit of it. It's 10 times that much. It's
Wow.
Galactus. You're like pouring this monster into the microphone.
Well,
So by the time I'm done, I'm sweating and my voice is hoarse, and Paul is in there, like he would, every time I do it, he'd come up and pat me on the back and go, "All right, man, you got another one in you?" And I go, "Oh yeah, let's do it." It was insane.
Oh my
man.
God.
It was crazy.
That
Yeah.
I can't imagine how that takes a physical toll on you.
Oh,
For
it
sure.
really does. Yeah, it really does. I think that's one of the aspects of voiceover that most people don't realize, especially with voice acting. There is an embodiment that takes place. It's not just talking to a mic, Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think if we want, Jesse, we can probably open up some questions. If people have any questions for Ryan.
Absolutely. And before I do that, I just want to say that hearing him do the Galactus voice totally made my whole night, because I was actually about to ask which was the most difficult job, and it sounded like from all of that work that went into just doing the one Galactus line, and it was just incredible. So if you are out in the audience and you have a question for Ryan, you are going to see, you now have the ability to raise your hand. So if you raise your hand, I will pass you the megaphone, and you can ask Ryan a question about any of his multiple types of experiences. All right. The doctor has a question. Dr. Game,
Yeah,
I'm passing you the megaphone. So you should see an alert there. And go ahead.
All right. Have you done any dubbing voiceovers for those type of commercials? Do you know why would people prefer to use a dub over with a certain actor rather than that original actor's voice? That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, okay. That is a good question.
Is it just more of a voice attractiveness to the product that they're trying to pitch, or?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of commercial, the voice is not dubbed. It's written and then we just record it. But I do a lot of dubbing for cartoons, and a lot of those cartoons are imports from other places, which means that they're in another language, which obviously gives you the reason why we have to dub those. But I will say this: I did dub it was not a good movie. It was called Mil Máscaras, the Mask of the Aztec or something. It was about a luchador who fights crime, basically.
I think I've seen that.
No way.
I have.
I think Bobby might actually be the secret identity for
I'm not kidding. If anybody here has seen that movie, I will kiss you on the mouth. I mean, that movie is it's like a D movie.
Bring it.
But listen, the main actor, the guy who played Mil Máscaras, his accent was so thick, and his acting was so bad, and he's wearing a mask the whole time, that they needed an actor to come in and redub all of his lines. And it was easy because he was wearing a luchador mask, so I really didn't have that much work to do there as far as matching the mouth flaps and stuff.
Nice.
But I'd say that would be in my experience, the main reason why that happens. But a lot of the other dubbing that I do is for Japanese import cartoons, and that's a whole other skill set because you do have to match lip flaps and get into the tone of the piece and stuff. It's an interesting thing, man.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question, dude. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from Christine. Christine, you have the megaphone.
Great. Hi, Ryan. How are you?
Hi.
Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So you talked a lot about the type of learner you were as a child and also as an adult, and you referenced numerous times about being a tactile, kinesthetic learner. I thought immediately about how we're preparing schools for students to re-enter in the fall, and we're looking at designing environments where kids will lose their ability to move freely around the buildings and to participate in that hands-on learning. So how, like, reflecting upon yourself, how would that have impacted you as a child and really as an adult in your learning process?
Man, that's a really interesting and somewhat profound question. I will say this.
Christine doesn't mess around, by the way. She's gonna
ask
dude, question.
Sorry.
Dig in. I love it. Let's peel it back. I'm here for it. Listen, I will say this. I was not, and I didn't mention this previously, but I was not a great student. I was easily distracted. I wouldn't say that I had like ADD, but I was like on the verge. I just didn't pay attention well in class. I couldn't sit through long lectures and stuff. It just didn't work for me. And so my grades in like things like math and social studies were not great. Where I excelled in school, the thing that I think was my savior in school were the art classes, the things where I got to get into a room and use things to create, and that is, again, I think that's always stuck with me. Now I've become a better learner as far as like I think reading has been really good for me. Like I have an affinity for that now, but I think I would have been a very poor student. I think the person who I am now would have been shaped much differently if I didn't have a place where I could express myself kinetically and have hands-on places. So it makes me worry. It does. I'm concerned about the future of our youth who don't have wood shop or jewelry class. I think it's important.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. No. Thank you. It's a good question.
And we have another question. This one is Micah. Micah, you have the megaphone.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for being on the show tonight.
What up, Micah?
Just keeping it real, the usual. I went on.
Oh boy.
I went on Finally Wrought while you were talking, by the way, and your work is super impressive. I love the little pirate sword. It made me think, like, did you get inspired by your work on Pan or something? A little pendant you made, but that's another story. I would really like to build off of what Christine's talking about, because in education it's likely children are going to be forced to be remote even more.
Yeah.
And what you're doing in your industry is you're making tangible experiences through your voiceovers and through your voice acting. And so what I'm wondering about, and I'm making this up as I go along, I'm wondering, how do you make yourself engaged when you're looking at a microphone and a computer screen? I'm trying to think, is there a strategy we can help learners at home to help them engage in a conversation when they might be sitting in a closet?
Yeah. I mean, Doc, you're not far off, man. I really think it is I'm serious. I think it is a practice of your mind and really being able to transport yourself to another world or into another body or into another way of thinking or speaking. I do a lot of video game voiceover, and it's fantasy, man. You're basically giving yourself permission to travel to another world and be another thing. And I think that all comes from allowing yourself to play. And play comes in so many forms. We play video games, we play board games, we play guns in the backyard or tag, whatever it is. And I really feel like the more we play, the more that imagination thing, that fantasy world, that escape ability is formed, and that I think is the essential ingredient to being able to sit in a closet and sort of get swept away. What's cool, and I think this is important, I'm doing a lot of auditioning now for this remote learning stuff, for things. What's the name of it's a Nickelodeon series that I'm auditioning for a lot, which does imagination work with kids. And basically, as the voice actor, I am the host of an imagination practice, which it does a cool thing like,
Wow.
you tell a kid like,
Cool.
all right, now close your eyes and listen for the ocean, right? And they'll play a little sound effect, and then in the living room you can tell kids like, now we're on an island, and look over there are the seagulls. Now look down and you can see your feet in the sand. Feel the sand in your feet. And now we're going to take a walk. We're walking to find treasure. There it is. Start digging. And you can guide. I think you can guide imagination if it's done the right way. And I think that this sort of new reality, with technology especially, we have an opportunity to engage in imaginations in I think a more kind of interesting and unique way. It's not quite the same, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Wow, that's really interesting.
That was really great.
Thank you.
So before we open up the room, I just want to take a moment to thank Ryan for being with us tonight.
Yes, give him some
There's so many
emojis.
awesome takeaways from that conversation. I want to also thank the Ready Learner 1 team, and in particular, Bobby Carlton for leading tonight's conversation, as well as our director of content, Matt Catilla, who has been standing in the front building this for your viewing pleasure and listening pleasure later as part of the Education Podcast Network. And please join us again next week for our season 1 finale, where we will be having a special guest, Amanda Fox. We're really excited, and we can't wait to see you next time.